Okay, thank you. Hello, good afternoon. Now, before I start speaking, I'll switch the microphone on. Right, okay. You'll hear me. I'll start again. Hello, good afternoon. Before I start speaking, I'd just like to make it clear that what I'm talking about here is teaching phonetics, so training phoneticians. I'm not talking about people with phonetics training applying that elsewhere. So right at the grassroots. And I'd like to begin by reading you a short story. When Daniel Jones, the greatest phonetician of the first part of the 20th century, was setting out on a fieldwork trip, a reporter asked him, "Professor Jones, what instruments are you taking with you?" DJ pointed to his ears and said, "Only these." And indeed, a century ago, I think it was very well understood that phoneticians needed extremely well-trained ears. Properly trained ears was a foregone conclusion, but today, I think this is often not the case. We seem to have lost sight, dare I say it, of our ears. So, why earless phonetics? I think the demise has been gradual, but I think it's usually for one of two main reasons, and I'm calling these exclusion by design and exclusion by default. Exclusion by design is the sort of situation that arises when people get particularly enthusiastic about the now very sophisticated and easily accessible speech analysis software, the machines, if you like. And they promote machine analysis at the expense of auditory analysis. The machines come first. Exclusion by default is what most of us experience, and this has to do very much with the current economic climate. Departmental budgets are cut regularly, routinely. And what better to economise on than something that is really quite costly to deliver? Traditional practical training, face-to-face in small groups, not only expensive but also very different from what students do in other parts of their course. Looks like some kind of optional bolt-on extra. Looks, therefore, as if something is something that can be easily dispensed with. We can just chop it off and save a lot of money. Bad news. But fortunately, there are people around who see the sense, who understand, who know better than actually cutting things off. And this particular sort of championship was begun way back by Jones and taken up by Peter Ladefoged. So two voices, essentially a century apart, but both of these people were passionate about ear training. DJ used to train his staff. They had weekly ear training sessions in the department, which many of you probably know. They had nonsense words from DJ himself. They had to read things back. They had to get it right. Two very distinguished practitioners. They're very unlikely both to have been so wrong about the same thing. They knew better. More recently, a third voice has been added to the chorus, another eminent phonetician. John Wells, in his outgoing speech as president of the International Phonetics Association, stressed the still very real need for the retention of training in practical skills, and especially highlighted the need for ear training. So, let's just have a look at what we do. This is a suggested timetable. Published by Ida Ward in 1929. Ida Ward was a colleague of Daniel Jones here in the department, and you can see that throughout 4 terms of this course, ear training is central. And it's not on its own, it's supported by the training of other practical skills. The other practical skills are things like reading transcription, writing transcription in English, training your voice, being able to use your voice in the way in which phoneticians should be good at. And all this sort of hands-on experience was underpinned by a very modest amount of theory, the lecture. Now that that was way back at the beginning of the last century. And at the beginning of this century, this kind of program does still exist. And this example is one that is current. It's one that I've taken from one of my own syllabus pro formas. And you can see teaching and learning methods section, the lectures in parallel with skills-based workshops, practical ear training sessions throughout. There is the ear training, still supported by practical skills. We do all the English and intonation and transcription practice there. And again, the hands-on experience underpinned by some theoretical input. Now, coincidentally, and this was a complete coincidence, I knew nothing at all about Ida Ward's timetable when I designed my own courses. Coincidentally, both models allow just 1/3 of the contact time, 33% of the hours available for theory. Why? Because students can get theory from books, but they can't get practice from books. And practice, as we know, takes time. By the 1970s, the move away from the intensive ear training that was envisaged in the early stages was being reflected in the syllabus and in the curriculum. And indeed, in the 5th edition of her book, Ida Ward actually removed that lovely timetable that we've just seen. She removed it completely, explaining that this was because of curricular changes in present-day colleges of education. In other words, the squeeze had begun, and the time-consuming, expensive things were being edited out. Today, the situation in my own department is becoming increasingly rare. And if you want further evidence, you've only got to look at the declining candidate numbers, the decline in the numbers of people presenting themselves for examination for the certificate of the International Phonetic Association. And if you think about that, it's obvious why. There are 200 marks for this exam. 140 of those marks are awarded for practical skills. And of those, half at least are awarded for achievement in various types of ear training exercises. Now, if you cut back on practical training, obviously people are no longer qualified to present themselves for this exam. Numbers have declined really dramatically. So, we have an argument. Do we go down the human road or do we follow the machines? The pro-human lobby, the expensive route, has the champions that we've already mentioned. Daniel Jones wrote that students of speech cannot become proficient in phonetics merely by reading descriptions. They must also perform practical exercises. A sentiment echoed by Peter Ladefoged when he wrote that most students can produce nearly all the sounds of the IPA chart, provided they have an instructor leading them through a set of practical exercises. Now, one of the things that made people favour machines was not just that, it's nice to see pictures, but that they believed that this kind of approach was less expensive. I'm not at all sure that that's right. But the pro-machine lobby, their view, was epitomised very nicely by something that Andy Butcher wrote in the 1980s, when he said that the days of the phonetician as a human tape recorder are over. Magnetic tape does the job far more efficiently. Oral and aural acrobatics, though sometimes still useful, are no longer sufficient or even essential requirements in phonetics. Now that's something that I would take issue with. My verdict is that there is a place for machines, but machines must be the servant and not the masters. What we're looking for is some kind of compromise, and we're looking to benefit from the new technology, not have it rule our lives. Machines, for example, detect far more than is audible to the human ear. And it's only the properly trained human ear at the end of the day that can tell us what of all that stuff that's detected is actually salient. So there's a place for machines. They can often illuminate particular points, as Peter Ladefoged said. Machines and humans then need to work together. Machines can help. They can help to explain differences. They can even, as we've seen, help in learning and acquiring new sounds, but they cannot hear and they cannot produce sounds for us. They cannot take over. And in the present context, we still need our ears. So it looks like I'm voting for the expensive route. And what we want to know is just how expensive is it? A few financial calculations show very clearly that a traditionally taught phonetics course is at least 3 times as expensive to deliver as a course with no need for small group practical work and no need for individual oral examinations. Let's make a comparison. My own department, for example, another core subject is syntax, which is taught as a lecture-based course with 3 contact hours a week for 12 weeks, all students together, done and dusted in 36 hours. The equivalent 12-week period on the phonetics course, however, involves an additional 3 or 4 hours of teacher time per week for the same number of students, say 60, who spend 2 hours in full group sessions, but are then allocated to their small practical groups, with the numbers being capped at around 15 these days. That's the remaining hour. And of course, that's still not the end of it, because you then want to know how well they've done, so you still have to assess them. There's an oral examination, 15 minutes per student, with 2 examiners in the room. The costs spiral, there's no doubt about it. Is it worth it? Well, the typical profile from mid-year assessment, halfway through the course, and exit point results suggests that the cost is actually unjustifiable. Because if you look at what you've got here, there's the mid-year results, you can see that there's very little difference at the exit point. It looks as if there's been no progress at all, but there are various things that you need to take into account, not least that the difficulty of the test materials increases accordingly. We expect more as we train more and students become more sophisticated. Nonetheless, to the uninitiated observer, the quality assurance police and the annual monitoring department from finance, it looks to them as if we're actually just not worth the cost. So, students appear to the outside world to reach their potential after 12 weeks, and further training then becomes completely redundant. It's not justifiable. Now, I felt this couldn't quite be what was going on, and I asked for volunteers. I got a group of 14 people who agreed to have not only their exit point exam, but also to repeat their mid-year test at the same time. So to take that test again after 12 more weeks of training. And now you can begin to see, probably, we already have a very different picture. There's the mid-year results, and the second line this time has points which are all slightly, almost all, slightly higher. The score has improved. One person has improved by a sort of gigantic 20% almost there. So yes, there is something going on. However, if you took the exit point and mid-year results for the same cohort, the same group, you've got exactly the same picture as we saw a few minutes ago when we looked at the typical cohort. You've got half a dozen people improving a bit. They're neatly balanced by another half dozen doing worse. That's a bit worrying. But nothing like the rosy picture that we saw in our retest on the basis of the mid-year materials. So, on the strength of the retest, I think it's reasonable to argue that improvement does take place. And given the increased difficulty of the exit point materials, students have improved in order even to stand still, in order even to pass the module. And if we compare the 3 sets of marks from the volunteer group, you can see this even more clearly. We have 3 students who improved in their exit point test, so obviously 3 very good students. But a further 9 improved when they retook the mid-year test, so 12 students improving overall. We do have a couple of mavericks, which is unfortunate, because these were volunteers, and I suspect these two were currying favour. They hadn't been to class, and they're the people who did worse. So, is it worth it? Well, yes, I think it is. The figures do seem to demonstrate that extended training does result in enhanced skills. 12 of the 14 students have improved, and under normal circumstances, we'd be saying that there's just a 21% improvement rate. We'd be looking at those three. Now, that is not enough to justify the cost. But if we can say that of those attending classes, 100% improved, of the total group, 86% improved, that is a much stronger platform to campaign from. So in conclusion, we've seen that there's still a need for practically trained phoneticians with good auditory skills. Machines can't take over, they can only help us out. We've also seen that the traditional training methods, expensive though they are to deliver, do seem to succeed. So whether or not we can devise strategies for increasing cost effectiveness, whether we can make those economies, I think we must find the way to continue to invest in the phoneticians of tomorrow. We must continue to train ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very clear and extremely well-timed presentation. Any questions?
Speaking to the mic.
Yes, Helmut Kilian, Germany. I would first of all congratulate to your wonderful paper, and then I have 2 points to make. The first is a remark, and the other is a question. The remark is my experience. Is that there is a certain trickle-down effect. So my advice is grab your mid-year examination and you will see how wonderful your students will do after one complete year learning the IPA sounds. That's my experience teaching the same stuff in Germany. And my question now is, my second point, is there any facility to conduct the IPA examen outside the UK? That is, for example, if I were doing it with my students in Germany, is there a possibility that I get the external examiner over from Britain or somewhere else? And how should I do it? And what does the IPA say about the whole procedure?
Okay. I can't scrap the mid-year exam, unfortunately, because it's a 2-module course and some students leave halfway, so they have to be assessed. And that's how all this discrepancy started to rear its ugly head. In terms of doing the IPA exam elsewhere, that's something that would need to be explored, because it would be quite costly to bring examiners and it would inevitably raise the examination fee. In principle, it could be done. In practice, you might find that it was not financially viable. But one of the things that we do have on the table at the moment is the possibility of resuscitating some of the other language certificates. So not just the certificate in the phonetics of English, but to reinstitute the certificates in German, Italian, French, Spanish, and maybe even introduce some more. So that's something which is now on the table and which we will be discussing over the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or remarks?
Perhaps I could thank you again for a beautiful talk and really make a comment. Since I've spent most of my life acquiring a nodding acquaintance with machines, perhaps I should say that machines cannot operate as well as the human ear. It still is the case, and it's not surprising after so many million years of evolution, that we can hear things far better still than even the most modern computational techniques can achieve in the way of analysis, even for simple things like pitch.
Yeah,
they cannot compete.
Absolutely.
So what you're doing is really to enhance something which is already superior. You've got a tremendously good foundation.
Well, exactly, and also sorting out what it is that's salient, as I said. I think it's very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Any remarks or questions? If not, I may have one tiny little thing. That is, in the old days, of course, talking about Daniel Jones and some other people that you mentioned, the computer programs were not available yet, so it was rather difficult to find assistance for e-training. That may have affected, of course, the absence of machines in those days. Don't you agree?
I think that's probably true, yes. I do know that there was a lot of equipment around, but not the sort of thing that could be readily rolled out in the average classroom. And I do know that Daniel Jones, along with his colleagues, was very, very interested in using this, but we've come a long way from that, and the touch of a button now
absolutely
allows us to, no, you're absolutely
and allows us to I think, to do both things at the same time, as you argued.
right.
Okay, thank you very much. Move on to the next speaker.